It is not the largest army that wins, nor even the bravest. The army that wins is the one that has something to put in the pot at night after a grueling march. In the 9th century, European kings assembled huge armies and built hundreds of supply wagons. They moved at the pace of a weary turtle and ate through their own provisions even before reaching the battlefield. And then, out of the fog, the northern guests would appear on their dracars. They brought with them anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 enraged warriors at a time. For the early Middle Ages, these were simply incredible numbers, capable of striking terror into any empire. But here's what really drove European monarchs mad. These northerners didn't have any food wagons at all. They didn't drag endless convoys of grain and herds of cows behind them. They didn't build long and vulnerable supply lines across half the continent. Modern military logisticians would look at this and call such a campaign impossible. An army of 10,000 men would starve to death in about 3 days without supplies. But the Vikings didn't die. They only grew stronger and faster. The secret was that they broke the cardinal rules of warfare in their time. They mastered medieval logistics not through massive warehouses, but through constant movement. Their supply system was so ruthless and effective that modern armies are still studying this phenomenon. Today, we'll examine exactly how these northern warlords managed to feed entire cities of hungry warriors far from home. Get ready to be amazed by just how ingenious this brutal machine of survival was. Imagine a massive army of 10,000 strong, trained, and very hungry men. Each of them swings a heavy battle axe daily, rows continuously for 10 hours a day, and wears heavy chainmail. Under conditions of constant physical exertion, such a man burns 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily just to maintain his strength. Multiply that figure by 10,000 warriors, and you get a veritable black hole that devours tons of varied food every day.
Thank you.
Feeding such a colossal horde in the 9th century was far more difficult for any ruler than winning the decisive battle itself. Ordinary peasant farms of that time could barely feed themselves, let alone supply entire legions. European kings solved this extremely difficult problem in the most straightforward, clumsy, and incredibly tedious way possible. They forcibly rounded up local peasants, loaded hundreds of creaking wooden carts with grain, and drove this slow-moving circus across completely impassable terrain. The speed of such a cumbersome convoy rarely exceeded 15 kilometers a day, even under the best of circumstances. Moreover, the draft horses and oxen consumed nearly half of all the supplies being transported before they even reached their destination. In rainy weather, the roads turned into impassable swamps where entire supply columns would get stuck fast. This was not a real war, but some kind of absurd competition to see who could eat through their own limited resources the fastest. The Vikings took a close look at this European logistical nightmare and decided to do things completely differently. They understood perfectly well that hauling huge food supplies with them for months-long expeditions was physically impossible and foolish. The main secret to their survival and incredible military successes sounded paradoxical, but it worked flawlessly. They almost never took any supplies with them for the entire upcoming military campaign. Their army survived solely on the strength of their phenomenal speed of movement and the ruthless exploitation of enemy food supplies. Instead of hauling sacks of grain from Scandinavia, they preferred to seize ready-made bread from terrified European peasants. It sounds like utter tactical madness, but behind this decision, there was always a very cold and precise mathematical calculation. The Norse knew the geography of the coastal regions perfectly and understood exactly where the full granaries of well-fed Europeans awaited them. They never ventured into remote forests or wild, swampy regions where there was nothing to take but dry pine cones and bitter acorns. They purposefully moved along the rich coastlines of the seas and the full-flowing rivers, penetrating deep into the heart of civilized Europe. For their light ships, the river was a high-speed highway that always guaranteed a well-stocked and laid-out table. Wealthy monasteries and trading towns were built right by the water, making them ideal targets for lightning-fast raids. For a long time, many modern historians could not understand exactly how these vast northern armies were formed and managed. In reality, it was never a unified state military machine with a rigid central command and a supply ministry. The Great Pagan Army was a temporary but highly effective coalition of dozens of completely independent units. Each chieftain brought his own trusted men on his own ships and bore full personal responsibility for their sustenance. This vastly simplified the overall task for the coalition's high command, completely relieving it of the grueling logistical nightmare. Each leader was given complete freedom of action in procuring provisions along the stretch of coastline assigned to him. Imagine a large modern corporation where each department earns its own salary and secures all necessary resources entirely on its own. That is exactly how the Viking war machine operated in those harsh and unforgiving times of the early Middle Ages. A squad leader had to be not only a skilled fighter on the battlefield, but also an excellent crisis manager. If, for any reason, he couldn't quickly find food for his men, the squad would simply move on to another leader without hesitation. Fierce internal competition constantly forced northern commanders to be incredibly resourceful in their search for precious calories. They learned to find vulnerabilities in the enemy's defenses and anticipate exactly where the most valuable supplies were hidden. They never, as a matter of principle, built long and vulnerable supply lines, as the Romans or later European armies did. In practice, a supply line means you have to leave a significant portion of your men behind to constantly guard the road against partisans. You have to build intermediate forts, protect slow supply trains, and constantly look back with anxiety, expecting an attack. The Vikings preferred not to have any rear at all that would need to be desperately defended against sudden enemy strikes. All their military logistics were always right under their own feet, or more precisely, under the sturdy keels of their fast ships. They were not dependent on land routes and could change direction in a matter of minutes. For the northern warrior, the ship served as a supply depot, a mobile barracks, a field hospital, and a fast means of transport all at once. Narrow, long, and incredibly maneuverable, the Drakkar could easily carry several tons of cargo while still navigating extremely shallow waters. Europeans built huge, heavy, and utterly unwieldy ships that desperately needed specially equipped deep-water ports. The Northerners, however, could easily dock right on a sandy beach or a gentle riverbank at any convenient moment. This gave them an incredible tactical advantage over the cumbersome and unwieldy armies of their continental enemies. They could land where no one ever expected to see them. Their fantastic mobility was their greatest weapon and the main way to permanently avoid a shameful death by starvation. They literally appeared out of nowhere, instantly took absolutely everything edible from the granaries, and vanished without a trace into the sea before the militia could gather. All the local lords could do was watch in helpless fury as their granaries emptied and the still smoking ruins of their villages lay before them. Their insane speed allowed the Vikings to always stay one crucial step ahead of any famine. They literally fled the threat of exhaustion, moving rapidly from one rich, defenseless target to the next. All of Europe became for them one huge warehouse of provisions that simply needed to be emptied at the right time. As a result, they created a brilliant military system that completely sustained itself directly in the course of its operations. The faster and more decisively they advanced, the more fresh food they could seize from a completely unprepared enemy. Modern military analysts refer to this approach as an expeditionary style of conducting active combat operations on foreign territory. The Northerners themselves, simply and without unnecessary philosophy, called it a good summer campaign for shiny silver and tasty meat. But to successfully carry out this daring plan, they vitally needed ideal and highly vulnerable targets to attack. Have you ever wondered why the fierce Vikings were so madly fond of raiding Christian monasteries all over Europe? The matter here had nothing to do with some deep-seated religious hatred or a fanatical desire to insult a foreign god. Everything in life was much more pragmatic, cynical, and ultimately boiled down to the simple desire to eat delicious, filling meals on a regular basis. The northern lands of Scandinavia never spoiled their inhabitants with bountiful harvests or a mild climate. Rocky soil, short, cold summers, and endless frosts forced people to constantly teeter on the brink of survival. In search of a better life, young Scandinavian men were forced to board ships and set out on dangerous voyages across stormy seas. Their main goal was not mythical glory or new lands, but simply resources that would help their families survive another harsh winter back home. Monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries AD were not merely quiet sanctuaries of the spirit, but veritable hubs of immense material wealth. But what mattered most to the starving northern warriors was that these holy places always held colossal, carefully organized stores of high-quality food. In those days, the church owned vast tracts of land and ran an exemplary estate, gathering the finest produce from the surrounding countryside. The monks were excellent administrators who knew how to organize the collection and storage of food. Consider this enticing situation solely from the perspective of a weary and hungry Scandinavian warrior who has just stepped onto the muddy shore after a grueling sea voyage. He had spent several weeks in the salty wind, subsisting on nothing but dried fish and stale water in the company of his rugged comrades. Any normal person after such an ordeal would dream of hot, hearty food and a soft bed. And here, right by the coast, a veritable treasure trove opens up before his eyes, filled with the most exquisite delicacies of the time. Before his eyes stands a massive, sturdy stone building, surrounded for miles by well-tended, fertile fields and roamed by plump herds of well-fed cows. Inside this opulent complex, completely unarmed people sit peacefully, having for years collected a generous tribute from the entire region in the form of grain and livestock. The clergy deliberately refused to carry swords, relying on divine protection and the sanctity of their abodes. To the professional warriors from the north, such peaceful behavior on the part of the hosts seemed like incredible foolishness and an open invitation to plunder. There were guaranteed to be huge oak barrels of excellent grape wine, wheels of rich cheese, smoked meat, and supplies of select barley ale. For the Vikings, this was essentially the ideal medieval version of a 24-hour supermarket with a completely free checkout at the exit. Monastic cellars were cleverly designed to maintain the ideal temperature for long-term storage of cheese and wine. The Northerners quickly realized this and began deliberately targeting precisely these well-stocked places. European monks truly worked tirelessly, constantly improving local agriculture and creating huge surpluses of valuable foodstuffs. They actively introduced advanced farming techniques, used new types of plows, and properly rotated the planting of various crops. Thanks to this, yields on the monastery fields were always several times higher than those of ordinary neighboring peasants. The monks also kept strict records of all supplies, carefully preserving every grain in case of lean years. They built very sturdy stone granaries, inside which dry grain could be safely stored for many years without the slightest loss of its nutritional value. Thick stone walls reliably protected the precious harvest from dampness, mold, and numerous rodents. The Vikings fully understood the value of dry, select grain, which could be easily transported in sacks directly on ships. This grain could feed entire crews of warriors for many months of arduous campaigns. They also expertly brewed excellent beer, which in those dark and dirty times was not merely alcohol, but a highly caloric and hygienically safe beverage. In the Middle Ages, clean drinking water was extremely rare, and consuming raw water from rivers often led to fatal diseases. The beer brewing process involved boiling, which completely killed all dangerous bacteria and made the drink safe. Nutritious ale gave warriors the energy they needed and helped them maintain their strength during long journeys. All the Vikings had to do was arrive on time in their fast ships and effortlessly collect the fruits of these long and arduous peasant labors. Scandinavian longships had a unique shallow draft, allowing them to navigate even the narrowest rivers with ease. They could silently sail upstream deep into enemy territory and appear before the monastery walls completely out of the blue. The monks simply couldn't physically manage to hide their enormous food supplies in a safe place. They themselves did not need to plow, sow, or toil during the harvest, for all this was done excellently for them by the church's obedient servants. Northern warriors preferred to devote their energy to weapons training and seafaring, rather than to hard physical labor in the fields. Why spend a whole year growing grain under a cold sky when you could take a ready harvest in just a couple of days in the warm southern lands? This simple military logic made raids the most profitable venture for young and ambitious Scandinavians. But it was by no means only quiet monasteries that regularly suffered from this ruthless and lightning-fast Scandinavian gastronomic tourism. The wealthy trading cities of medieval Europe also, with enviable regularity, became an excellent and very attractive target for the urgent replenishment of dwindling army supplies. Large cities boasted well-developed markets and vast warehouses, where goods from all surrounding regions were brought in daily. For the voracious Northern Army, such trade centers were a real treat. When the massive and fearsome Northern Army of 10,000 men approached the high city walls, it did not always immediately launch a bloody massacre. The Vikings were by no means mindless barbarians who sought to destroy everything in their path for the sheer pleasure of it. They understood perfectly well that storming a fortified city always entailed enormous losses among their own experienced fighters. It was far more advantageous to get what they wanted through diplomacy, intimidation, and a demonstration of their overwhelming military might. Often, cunning leaders would simply issue a harsh ultimatum to local authorities, demanding the immediate surrender of vast quantities of provisions for their starving men. They offered the townspeople a simple deal, promising to spare the lives of the inhabitants and not burn their homes in exchange for food. This approach suited both sides, as city rulers valued the safety of their subjects more than the supplies in their warehouses. Negotiations usually proceeded quickly, as the sight of thousands of armed northerners at the city walls greatly encouraged the generosity of local authorities. The terrified townspeople had very few options in such a situation, so the city granaries were quickly emptied to save human lives. From the gates of the besieged city, an endless line of carts stretched out, loaded with sacks of flour, salted meat, and barrels of ale. The townspeople understood that food could always be grown again, but the fallen defenders could never be brought back. Thus, the Vikings obtained tons of excellent provisions without firing a single arrow. This brazen tactic of directly seizing ready-made provisions was incredibly effective in military campaigns and saved the Norse a great deal of precious time. Instead of hauling huge food convoys from Scandinavia, they preferred to supply themselves on the spot at the expense of the local population. This made their army incredibly fast and maneuverable, since they didn't need to guard slow-moving wagons on the road. They could move at astonishing speed, outpacing any rumors of their approach. The siege of any fortified city requires long months of agonizing waiting, the complex construction of siege engines, and heavy, bloody battles beneath the walls. During this time, dangerous epidemics of disease often broke out within the besieging army due to poor hygiene in the camps. And the besiegers themselves could quickly run out of food in the ravaged countryside, turning from hunters into prey. Northerners strongly disliked staying in one place for long and wasting their precious summertime for nothing. They always preferred quick and decisive armed raids, swiftly obtaining the necessary provisions and immediately moving further down the river. Their tactics relied on the element of surprise and a lightning-fast retreat before a large royal army could assemble to repel them. As soon as the provisions were loaded onto the ships, the Vikings instantly hoisted their sails and vanished over the horizon. Their rapid decision-making saved them from the threat of starvation far better than any pre-stocked supplies at home. Sometimes, for convenience, this massive pagan army would split into several small, highly mobile groups of 200 or 300 experienced warriors. This division of forces allowed them to operate simultaneously in multiple directions, paralyzing the entire local defense system. Small detachments could easily move along narrow forest paths and use small streams inaccessible to large vessels. Local lords simply did not know where exactly the next strike would be directed and could not muster their forces together. This was done specifically to avoid accidentally depleting all the food resources of a single specific territory too quickly. Too large a concentration of people in one place instantly led to the complete depletion of all supplies within a radius of many kilometers. Wise leaders understood that the burden on the conquered lands had to be distributed so that the warriors always had access to fresh food. Imagine a voracious swarm of locusts that deliberately splits into small groups to effectively cover as much of the green field as possible. Each such group methodically plundered only its designated area of responsibility, collecting food tribute from small villages and isolated farms. Peasants in remote hamlets were completely defenseless against well-armed professional warriors. Without argument, they handed over chickens, pigs, fresh butter, and last year's grain reserves to the Northerners. Late in the evening, these mobile groups could calmly regroup at a prearranged location, noisily discuss the day's spoils, and hold a grand communal dinner by the campfire. Modern environmentalists would surely call such behavior a principle of sustainable resource consumption, but only in a very specific and aggressive form. The Vikings acted like calculating predators who perfectly understood the carrying capacity of their hunting grounds. They did not seek to completely wipe out the local population, for dead peasants would never again be able to grow a new harvest. The Scandinavians needed a living, functioning ecosystem capable of regularly generating new food supplies. If this entire armed mob of 10,000 people were to linger in a single small valley for even a week, not even a blade of green grass would be left there. The horses would have eaten all the pastures, and the people would have quickly slaughtered even the oxen needed for plowing. This would lead to the complete economic collapse of the region and the starvation of all local residents by the coming winter. Smaller, mobile detachments, on the other hand, could move along the roads much faster and, at the same time, did not completely deplete the area. They carefully took only the most valuable, high-calorie, and nutritious items, deliberately leaving the unfortunate peasants just enough food to keep them from starving to death over the winter. It was a cold, mathematical calculation, devoid of any pity or compassion for the conquered peoples. The Northerners left behind just the bare minimum of seeds and livestock needed to restore the farm by the next season. After all, exactly 1 year later, The shrewd northerners planned to return to these very same lands for a new, ripe harvest. Of course, not all the food they captured was ideally suited for being taken aboard a rocking ship without issues. Fresh vegetables quickly rotted in the dark, damp holds, and freshly baked wheat bread went stale after just a few days at sea. The Vikings needed food that could withstand sudden temperature changes and high humidity without losing its nutritional value. They had to process their captured booty right on the go. Fresh meat spoils in just a couple of days, especially during the warm summer months or during a long sea voyage under sail. In the cramped conditions of a drakkar, warm meat quickly became a source of dangerous toxins and could poison the entire ship's crew. Therefore, in the coastal territories they captured, the Vikings immediately began the process of actively and extensively stockpiling food for the journey. They set up temporary camps on islands or sandbars that were easy to defend against enemies. They herded and slaughtered hundreds of head of local livestock, after which they immediately began to smoke it diligently or salt it heavily right on the sandy shore. The smoke from huge bonfires spread for many miles around, while the warriors carefully sliced and hung thin strips of meat. Salt was worth its weight in gold in those days, and the Vikings often took it from monasteries primarily for this very purpose. These people were able to transform fresh, perishable spoils into reliable, long-lasting provisions with astonishing speed. These rugged seafarers truly knew how to survive and work effectively in conditions where they had almost no access to a proper field kitchen for weeks on end. It was impossible to build a full-scale fire on the deck of a drakkar, as wooden ships could easily catch fire in the open sea. The warriors had to subsist exclusively on dry rations that required no heat treatment before consumption. Their daily food had to withstand the constant dampness of the open drakkar, the midday heat, and the endless rocking on the cold, salty waves. If you've ever gone on a long hiking trip at least once in your life, you fully understand the importance of proper food preservation. In the wild, any mistake in preparing provisions can result in severe food poisoning or the complete loss of all food. The Vikings had no way to pop into the nearest store for fresh food. Their lives depended entirely on the contents of their ship's barrels. Ordinary soft bread in the damp hold quickly became covered in green mold, and fresh cow's milk soured long before sunset. It was surprisingly light as ordinary dry cardboard, incredibly hard as centuries-old wood, and yet as nutritious as the finest juicy steak. It could be stored for years under the most terrible conditions, and it lost none of its beneficial properties from exposure to dampness or cold. Warriors could gnaw on it right while rowing, or quickly soak it in plain water to make a hearty porridge. Without this strange but ingenious food invention, the long voyages across the endless icy ocean to the shores of America would have been nothing short of guaranteed suicide for the Vikings. And now we're talking about something that smells so distinct and pungent that modern, pampered people often cover their noses with their hands in disgust when they encounter it. The Vikings' main weapon was actually neither a battle axe nor a trusty steel sword. It was ordinary dried cod, which was found in abundance off the cold northern coasts. Such a statement sounds completely unepic and even a bit comical for these fearsome conquerors. But it was precisely this unpretentious dried fish that allowed them to fearlessly cross the oceans and conquer distant lands. Without this humble food source, the Scandinavians simply would not have been physically able to make their great geographical discoveries. In Scandinavia itself, this unique product has long been called stockfisk, which literally translates into English as stickfish. And this simple name incredibly accurately and succinctly describes its appearance and basic physical properties. To the touch, and due to its striking hardness, the finished carcass truly resembled a dry piece of wood. The process of its preparation was ingenious in its natural simplicity and absolute ecological efficiency. Cod was caught in vast quantities in the icy northern waters off the coast of Norway during the spring spawning season. The fish were then gutted, their heads carefully cut off, washed, and simply hung in pairs on special wooden poles out in the open air. The frosty, salty wind and bright spring sun did all the rest of the hard work without any human intervention. Absolutely all the natural moisture gradually evaporated from the fish, meaning that dangerous bacteria could not physically multiply in it. No scarce salt was required for this preservation method, which was a huge advantage for thrifty households. After all, high-quality salt in those distant times was incredibly expensive and valued literally as much as pure silver. Nature itself preserved the catch for free, turning perishable fish into a long-lasting ration for future sea voyages. As a result of this long, natural drying process, a unique product was produced that lost up to 80% of its original weight. Yet, all the beneficial proteins and nutrients were fully preserved in the dried fish without any loss. Essentially, it was a concentrated, high-protein bar from the 9th century AD. Modern professional bodybuilders would surely sell their souls for such an ideal source of pure protein without a single gram of unhealthy fat. Stockfish could be stored for years on end in a dry place without any issues, and it remained perfectly fine. For the complex logistics of the Northern Navy, this fact was of simply colossal and decisive strategic importance. Incredibly light food on board meant that every fast ship could carry far more armed warriors. Or it could free up valuable space in the holds for loading heavy looted European gold and silver. Dried fish was simply packed tightly into ordinary cloth sacks and required absolutely no special conditions for transport. It could be safely tossed onto the damp bottom of a boat, regularly splashed with salty seawater, and still not spoil. It was truly the ideal army food, created by the harshest northern nature for the extreme conditions of long expeditions. However, trying to eat this dry, woody substance in its original form was a grueling ordeal not for the faint of heart or weak of teeth. Usually before eating, the Vikings would pound the hard fish long and hard with the back of a battle axe or a heavy coastal rock. This was done to soften the dry fibers as much as possible and make them at least somewhat chewable. Then the fish prepared in this way was boiled for a long time in a large copper cauldron along with salted seawater. They also threw edible roots, wild onions, and whatever else the warriors could quickly find on the foreign shore into this portable cauldron. The result was a very thick and rich stew that provided the exhausted men with a huge amount of energy for hard physical labor. But sometimes in emergencies, they would simply chew on dry, stringy pieces of fish for hours on end, right in the middle of grueling rowing. This helped distract them from the monotonous labor, warmed their jaws, and gradually nourished their bodies with nutrients. Stockfish was a faithful companion to every rower, from their native fjords to the shores of misty England. In addition to dried cod, the sailors' meager diet on voyages was greatly supplemented by a variety of fermented foods, which they had thoughtfully brought from home. Historically, Scandinavians have had a particular culinary fondness for foods that had already begun to spoil in a controlled and safe manner. One of the main culinary treasures on board was always skyr, a thick and tangy fermented milk product. In appearance and consistency, it closely resembled modern thick yogurt or low-fat cottage cheese. Skyr could be stored successfully in large wooden barrels for a very long time precisely because of its naturally high acidity. For the warriors' bodies, it was simply an excellent source of easily digestible calcium and beneficial lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria reliably protected the stomachs of these rugged warriors from dangerous intestinal infections that often decimated other medieval armies. The Northerners also never ate regular butter fresh because it quickly went rancid. The Vikings heavily salted the butter or simply buried it deep in peat bogs for prolonged fermentation underground. In the airless bog environment, the butter acquired a very sharp, cheesy flavor, a dark color, and a distinct, strong odor. However, after this strange process, this valuable fat could be stored for years without any refrigeration at all. It sounds like a terrible and completely wild idea for a modern family breakfast. But under the harsh conditions of long voyages across the cold northern seas, this oil was a true lifesaver for people. The high caloric content of the fermented fat helped them warm up quickly and effectively maintain their core body temperature in the icy water. Physical survival in the harsh climate has always been the top priority for Northerners, overshadowing any culinary delights. Fresh meat on long voyages was a rare treat because live livestock took up too much of the scarce space on the ship. But if they captured a herd from local European settlers, they immediately employed proven methods for quickly preserving the meat. The meat was actively smoked in the thick smoke of campfires to reliably kill all parasites and create a protective dry crust on the surface. Sour whey, left over from making cottage cheese or cheese at home, was also often used for preservation. Large pieces of meat were soaked thoroughly in this sour liquid before being placed in barrels. Lactic acid reliably preserved valuable animal protein, making it perfectly suitable for long sailing voyages lasting several weeks. Their entire culinary philosophy was extremely simple, strict, and entirely governed by the harsh realities of daily survival. Camp food had to take up as little space as possible, provide maximum pure energy, and never spoil during transport. They cared absolutely nothing for the presentation of their meals, the cleanliness of their dishes, or any subtle nuances of flavor in their food. Their strong stomachs were perfectly trained to digest coarse, salty, and tough food under any extreme conditions. This remarkable physiological adaptation made the Northern Army incredibly unpretentious and resilient in their daily life on the march. The pampered soldiers of other European armies often mutinied if they weren't given fresh, soft bread on time. Northern warriors, however, could eat nothing but dried fish and sour milk for an entire month without complaint, while fully maintaining their fighting spirit. This gave them a massive advantage in mobility, which was completely out of reach for the slow and capricious armies of the Southern kings. But sometimes their conquests dragged on so long that even such hardy Northerners needed a reliable permanent base. And then, with all their determination, they shifted to a completely different strategic level of planning their expansion. Initially, Viking raids were an exclusively seasonal business, closely tied to the capricious northern weather. They sailed to the shores of Europe in the warm spring, actively plundered defenseless settlements all summer, and hurried home before the onset of the destructive autumn storms. The harsh winter sea forgave no mistakes, so no one wanted to risk their ships during the cold season. But in the 9th century, the situation changed dramatically, and the Scandinavians decided to permanently shatter this familiar and convenient system for Europeans. Instead of obediently sailing home with their plundered booty, a massive pagan army simply remained in England for the entire winter. This bold and unexpected decision turned all of European logistics, military strategy, and international diplomacy upside down. Previously, European rulers knew that they only had to endure the summer raids, and in winter, they would get a long-awaited respite to recover their strength. Now, however, the enemy had settled right on their soil, leaving them no chance to lick their wounds and raise a new militia. The Vikings began actively building well-fortified winter camps, gradually transforming the conquered territories into their permanent military bases. Their choice of a specific wintering site was always strategically ideal, safe, and thought out down to the smallest detail. Usually, this was a hard-to-reach island in the middle of a full-flowing river or a narrow, fortified cape where any cargo could be easily and quickly delivered by water. This location made the camp virtually invulnerable to surprise attacks by heavy European cavalry, which lacked boats. And most importantly, this winter camp was always surrounded by rich and fertile farmland. Now, the northern warriors no longer had to haul food with great difficulty across the stormy sea to the far reaches of the earth. They simply forced the frightened local inhabitants to feed them without question throughout the cold winter. Wintering on hostile enemy territory solved once and for all the most critical problem facing any medieval army of the time. Typically, in late autumn, all European troops would obediently disband and return home because rulers simply had no means to support and feed their soldiers during the winter. The Vikings, however, operated quite differently. They simply took entire fertile regions under their strict control and began systematically gathering food there. They took every last bit of the ripe harvest from English farmers, effectively forcing them to work for them for free. Yesterday's fierce pirates quickly turned into harsh, cynical, yet highly effective administrators and tax collectors. Over time, the English kings came to realize with horror that it was practically impossible to quickly drive this organized army out of its fortified winter camp. The Scandinavian warriors could sit comfortably behind their high wooden walls for months on end, calmly consuming the vast supplies gathered from the surrounding fields. And then, the bewildered European rulers came up with a solution that seemed very clever and simple to them at that particular moment. They decided to simply pay the brazen invaders a huge ransom so that they would voluntarily pack up their belongings and sail off to plunder someone else. This shameful practice of regular ransom payments went down in world history under the well-known name of Danegeld, or Danish money. At first glance, it sounds quite logical. You simply pay a certain ransom, and the armed bandits leave your hometown alone. But in reality, it was a classic, brazen racket on an incredible national scale, which only spawned new problems. The Vikings happily took tons of pure silver, loaded it onto their ships, and sailed off triumphantly toward the sea. And the very next year, they invariably returned, bringing even more hungry friends with them and demanding a new, even more substantial payment. They quickly realized that the mere constant threat of brutal violence brought in far more calories and wealth than the violence itself. Why shed your own blood and lose valuable men in a grueling battle for grain when a frightened king will bring it to your feet himself? The weak English kingdoms voluntarily handed over to the invaders incredible sums of money and thousands of tons of choice provisions. This was, perhaps, the most comfortable and secure supply line in the history of warfare at that time. Your enemy worked hard in the fields in the rain, harvested the crops himself, and brought them straight to your camp. Resourceful Scandinavian leaders masterfully turned military terror into a highly profitable and stable economic tool. Some modern historians have calculated that over the years of raids, England paid the Vikings far more silver than was left in the country itself. These colossal sums went toward purchasing the best Frankish weapons, building new drakers, and hiring young, fearless warriors. The pagan army grew rapidly, its appetites increasing with each passing day, and the system they had created continued to successfully sustain itself. It was practically the ideal business plan of the early Middle Ages, based entirely on primal fear and the fleet's superior mobility. Local rulers simply could not physically keep up with the constant and unpredictable movements of this deadly threat. If a particular region was completely drained by extortion and could no longer pay tribute, the Norse were not the least bit upset about it. They simply boarded their maneuverable drakers and quickly sailed across the strait to France or moved on to wealthy Ireland. They behaved like cynical modern investors constantly seeking new, promising markets for their profitable investments. As soon as the overall return on plunder in one place dropped, they instantly changed locations, leaving behind scorched and empty land. The complete lack of any strong attachment to a single specific base made their army absolutely invulnerable to the threat of starvation. In classical military theory, any land army is always firmly tied to its supply depots by an invisible, unbreakable chain. If you can successfully cut off a general from his supply train, his starving soldiers are guaranteed to surrender in just a few weeks. But how can you cut off an army from its supplies when it buys its food by preying on the fear of your own terrified population? You cannot surround and besiege the Vikings because they can always quickly board their ships and sail off in an unknown direction. Their military logistics were absolutely invulnerable because they were not stored in warehouses, but in the minds of their terrified enemies. This unique system of aggressive supply worked flawlessly throughout nearly 3 centuries of continuous Scandinavian expansion. The northern armies swept across all of Europe like a destructive steamroller, from the icy shores of distant Scotland to the warm coast of the Mediterranean. And everywhere they applied the same tried-and-true method of physical survival with unwavering success. They forced the entire surrounding world to feed them effectively using their mobility, brutality, and cold calculation. And this brings us to the most important secret of their striking and incredible historical success. Ultimately, we see a completely unique model of warfare for the early Middle Ages. The Vikings did not invent clever machines for transporting grain, nor did they build giant warehouses in the rear. They simply rejected the very idea of hauling food supplies thousands of kilometers behind them. Their genius lay in their ability to adapt to their environment and use the enemy as a source of resources. Speed was their primary logistical tool, replacing thousands of carts and wagons. They turned rivers into their roads and monasteries into free food distribution points. Their diet consisted of dried fish and sour milk, which sounds like a gourmet's nightmare. But it was precisely this austere diet that allowed them to cross the Atlantic and redraw the map of the world. They proved that victory does not go to the army with the largest stockpiles. Victory goes to the army that can procure food faster than it can get hungry. Today, logistics has become an exact science, utilizing satellites and transport aircraft. Modern armies spend billions of dollars to deliver a hot meal to every soldier at the base. But the principles laid down by the rugged seafarers of the North remain relevant today. Mobility, autonomy, and speed will always prevail over heavy and cumbersome systems. The northern leaders understood this 1,000 years ago when they simply got into their boats and set out in search of food.